Today we're going to discuss how Africans and African descendants gained their freedom in Latin America from slavery. We will be comparing two different avenues of which Africans and their descendants gained freedom and how these processes impacted Latin American nations and or national ideology.
This is important to know because it's different from North America, where only 4% of enslaved Africans were sent to. So by focusing specifically on Latin America, we will be learning how the majority of slaves obtained their freedom.
There are many ways Africans could gain their freedom. Masters could free their slaves at any time they wanted to, and some masters even released slaves after they had passed in their wills. Slaves could run away. They bought or bartered for their freedom, and some even joined the military in seek of gaining freedom from masters, because they would join, and if they lived through a war, or expected that afterwards they'd be given equal rights as everyone else.
The two ways that we will be specifically comparing are enslaved Africans buying or bartering their freedom, and enslaved Africans running away for freedom. We will be looking not just at their differences, but also the success of freedom that these two strategies led to, and specific examples and stories that show these strategies in use.
We'll start with talking about Africans and their descendants buying or bartering for their freedom. It was very common for a slave to pay their own purchase price or have family or friends pay their purchase price. One great example of this is in 1770s when a man named Juan Alexos de Estrada continuously kidnapped 4 to 5 horses from his master's estate and made demands for the return. Eventually, he did this multiple times, but eventually in that bartering, he bartered for his freedom and gained his independence. This example was found in the book Blacks and Blackness in Central America, chapter 5, page 161.
Another very interesting example of buying one's freedom happened in 1796 when a woman named Isabel Arez traded winning lottery tickets for her freedom paper from her master. What her master didn't know was that the tickets were fakes obtained by Isabel's lover. When it came to light that the tickets were fake, her master tried to revoke Isabel's freedom paper, but the audiencia upheld the credibility of that paper that was signed. This example was found in the book Blacks and Blackness in Central America, chapter 5, page 161.
Another common example of slaves bartering for their freedom was by petitioning a court. They would appear in court and testify to a judge of the mistreatment they had endured, or even families and friends had endured to possibly gain freedom. The courts didn't always grant them this freedom, but there are many examples of enslaved Africans and their descendants being granted reparation.
We will now move on to talking about how slaves would gain freedom by running away. One specific example of this is the slave Maria Josefa Godinez. She ran from her masters who lived in the capital in the year 1789. She ran away after suffering a very cruel punishment where her hair was cut off, and she was then locked in a dark room for 4 days. She was only brought food twice a day while she was locked in the dark room. She then escaped on the 4th day of isolation through a hole she dug herself in the wall. She tried appealing to the audiencia but was rejected. It is unknown whether or not she was returned to her master or whether she was able to remain free. This example was found in the book Blacks and Blackness in Central America, chapter 5, page 162 and page 163.
The lines between slavery and free labor began to fade due to people of African descent coming and going as they pleased and jumping from one plantation to another in little periods. In the Reading Blacks and Blackness in Central America chapter 5, page 162, tells the story of Manuel Gonzalez, who was always who ran away freeing himself and then continued to come and go from the plantation that he was a slave at. And he would also work at other plantations in other locations around him for free.
Most commonly, when slaves would run away, they would find work elsewhere. This was most common specifically with women who would acquire jobs working in Spanish homes as child caregivers and housemaids. This worked in their favor because Spaniards who resided in more city areas often complained about the shortage of domestic servants and housemaids. So these former enslaved women were able to step up and fill these positions.
To go back and touch on the differences in ways slaves gained their freedom, slaves in Latin America were given a lot more leeway or they had more options in ways of gaining freedom. Unlike slaves in North America, where the only option was pretty much running away, and more often than not, they were returned to their masters, and even after they were free, and suffered a worse fate if they had stayed a slave. A lot of times they were whipped or they were even killed for even attempting to run away. We can now start thinking more in depth about the more than 90% of Africans that were taken to Latin America and Central America, and the strategies that were available for them to gain their freedom.
These strategies for people of African descent to obtain freedom affected the national ideology of South America because it led to the mixing of African and Latin American cultures due to Africans marrying people of Latin America, and so it created a mix of race. This then caused the ideal of racelessness to be a prominent component of their society.
Now on to our key takeaways for this mini lecture. Some key takeaways for this mini lecture are slavery in Latin America is a side of history that is less heard of and less talked about in North America, but it's what majority of slaves and enslaved Africans coming from Africa went through. The strategies that they used to gain their freedom is important because it was what shaped Central and South America's society for African Americans and Latinos and everyone who was of color in South America. And it formed the idea of racelessness rising up in society. Thank you.